Good evening, Cubs. Tonight I'll be reading from the Young Collector's Illustrated Classics, Tales of Terror and Suspense, which is, in this particular volume, Edgar Allan Poe. So, sit back, close your eyes, and try to have a good evening if you can. The first story in this book is actually the first one that was read to me when I was a cub. The Telltale Heart. Hopefully I won't have too much trouble reading this. True, I'm nervous and always have been. But why say that I'm insane? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed them. Above all, my sense of hearing was keen. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How, then, can I be insane? Listen and observe how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how the idea first entered my brain, but once it did, it haunted me day and night. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never insulted me. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, that was it. He had an eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever that eye fell upon me, my blood ran cold. So, very gradually, I made up my mind to take his life and rid myself of that eye forever. You should have seen me, seen how wisely I went about it, with caution and foresight. I went to work. I was never more kind to the old man than I was during the week before I killed him. Every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. Then, when I had made an opening large enough for my head, I put in a lantern with its shutters closed, so that no light shone out. Then I stuck in my head. You would have laughed to see how sneakily I stuck it in. It moved slowly, very slowly, so that I would not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening far enough for me to see him on his bed. Ah, would a madman have been so wise? Then, when my head was well inside the room, I undid the lantern shutter cautiously, oh, so cautiously, because the hinges creaked, and I undid it until a single thin ray of light fell upon the vulture eye. I did this for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight, but the eye was always closed. I found it impossible to kill him then, for it was not the old man I hated, but his evil eye. Every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him. I would call him by his name in a hearty tone, and ask him how he had slept. You see, he would have been a very clever old man indeed to suspect that I spied on him every night as he slept. On the 8th night, I was more cautious than usual in opening the door. My hand moved more slowly than the minute hand on a watch. Never before that night had I felt the power of my own brilliance. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door little by little, and he never even dreamed of my secret deeds or thoughts. I chuckled at the idea. Perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think I drew my head back at this, but no. His room was black as pitch with a thick darkness. The shutters were shut tight for fear of robbers, so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door. I kept pushing it open steadily, steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern's shutter when my thumb slipped on the tin fastening. The man sprang from his bed and cried out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle. In the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done night after night, listening for signs of death. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew that it was a groan of terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh, no. It was a low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when it is overwhelmed with awe. I knew that sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, as welled up from my own heart. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled inside too. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise. His fears had been growing ever since. He had not tried to stop worrying, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney," or "It is only the mouse crossing the floor." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these hopes, but the black shadow of death had stalked and embraced its victim. That mournful shadow made him feel my presence in the room, even though he could not see or hear it. When I had waited long enough, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I decided to open a very little crack in the lantern. So I opened it, you cannot imagine how quietly, until a simple dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the crack and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed on it. I saw it clearly, a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled me to my bones, but I could see nothing else of the old man. I directed the ray, as if by instinct, precisely upon the horrible spot. What you mistake for insanity is only my keenness of my senses. There came then to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, the sound that a watch makes when it has been wrapped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum makes a soldier courageous. Even so, I kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried to keep the ray of light trained upon the eye. Meanwhile, the horrible heartbeat increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. And then, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, that strange noise excited me into uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer I stood completely still. The beating grew louder, louder. I thought that the heart would burst. Then a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. I could not let that happen. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once, only once. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not bother me. It would not be heard through the wall. At least it ceased. The old man was dead. I moved the bed and examined the body. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. No pulse. His eye would trouble me no more. If you think me insane, you would think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took in hiding the body. The night wore on, and I worked quickly, but in silence. First of all, I cut up the body, and then I pulled up 3 planks from the floor of the bedroom and hid the body parts there. I replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatsoever. I had been too careful for that. A tub had caught that. Ha ha. When I finished, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the church bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to it with a light heart, for what had I to fear? 2 men politely introduced themselves as police officers. A neighbor had heard the old man shriek, and suspecting foul play, had called the police. The police officers were there to search the house. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I welcomed the gentlemen in. The shriek, I told them, had been my own in a dream. The old man, I told them, had gone on a trip. I took my visitors all over the house. I urged them to search, and search well. I led them eventually to his bedroom. I showed them his treasures, secure and undisturbed. I brought chairs into the room and invited them to rest. With wild arrogance, I put my own seat upon the very spot the old man's body lay. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them I was at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But soon I felt myself getting pale, and I wished that they would go. My head ached, and I heard the ringing in my ears. But still they sat and chatted. The ringing became more clear. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued to keep getting clearer until I realized that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew pale, but they talked more and raised my voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much like the sound that a watch makes when it is wrapped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard nothing. I talked more quickly, more energetically, but the noise increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high voice with violent gestures, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, but the noise increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the floorboards, but the noise continuously increased. It grew louder and louder and louder, and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible that they heard nothing? No, no, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making fun of my horror. Anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this mockery. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. "Villains!" I shrieked. "Lie to me no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here! It is the beating of his hideous heart."